In today's video, we're going to dive deeper into Next.js 13, extending on the full stack app we created in the introduction video. We're going to add client components, state and user interactivity. We're going to talk about suspense and error boundaries. We're going to talk about static versus dynamic rendering. We're going to also extend our Prisma schema to create a second collection and relate that to our users, and much more. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Hamid. I'm a full stack JavaScript web developer, and here on this channel we mainly talk about modern web dev topics like React and Next.js. So let's get into this. Let's get started by looking at what we're going to build together. If you remember from the introduction video, we created this full stack app where we had two tabs for home and for our users, and in the users tab we would fetch some users from our database, show them as this sidebar navigation, and when going to each of these users, we're going to show a loading state. We're going to then fetch some tweets for that specific user and add them as a client component where we can add state to add some interactivity to this component, so the user can like and dislike this tweet. Let's continue where we left off in the introduction video. The first thing that I like to add is some sort of a loading state while we're navigating between these users. Notice that when I click, it takes a second for it to load the new user, and the app doesn't do or doesn't show any indication of it's actually navigating away or reacting to this click. We can easily improve this by adding a loading.jsx file in our route directory, which uses React Suspense behind the scene to show a fallback loading component while it's fetching data. So let's go ahead and add that right where we have our users layout. I'm going to add a loading.jsx, and I'm going to paste a component that just shows a loading text. Let me just remove this throttle so we can go back, refresh our page. And now when I'm going to users, we would see that loading whenever we're navigating to the users. And when I'm navigating between my users, I see that loading text showing me that something happened. The app is reacting to this click while it's fetching the data, and it's going to swap the loading fallback component that we're defining here with the actual users component, or user component in this case, when the data is back. Similarly, we can add a error.jsx file that is going to act as an error boundary. And if anything happens, if the server throws an error, it will be captured in this error boundary and it will prevent it from crashing our app. An example error boundary component can be found on the new Next.js documents, which I'm going to copy and use over here. Let me remove this type since I'm not using TypeScript. What you may notice on this file is this use client directive. Now, up until this point, every component that we've used inside the app directory was using React Server components by default, unless you put in this use client directive at the top of the file, which instructs Next.js that this is a client component where we can use React hooks such as useEffect. Now, if you look at the docs, it mentions that the error boundary component must be a client component, and that's why we are having this directive up top. We're going to add more client components as we are extending this app, but just so you know, for adding an error boundary to your routes, you can use such a component that's a client component. You could use it to log your errors to a reporting service, and you can also have this reset function that's passed to your error boundary component to kind of reset your error boundary or to reset your error. Now, the next thing you might think to yourself is that where is the static site generation or the incremental static regeneration or the server-side rendering? Those stuff and functions that we are used to from Next.js 12, get static paths, get static props, get server-side props. What happened to those? Now things are a bit different. We're still having static and dynamic rendering, meaning that files or components are either statically generated at build time on the server, or they're dynamically rendered on the server but at request time. To understand what's going on in our app right now, let's just stop our development server and run npm run build and look at the result. If I expand this so we can see what's going on. So the build process is done. And as you can see here, these are the pages that were created during our build process. The home page, the about page, the users, the dynamic route for the users, and some routes for 404 and our API folders. Now, this Lambda sign shows a server-side rendered page that's run at runtime, and this empty circle shows a statically generated page at build time. So as you can see, our users is a statically generated page, but the dynamic user or the dynamic route or path that we have, it's a server rendered or dynamically rendered route. Now you might think to yourself, in NextJs 12 we were able to statically generate even dynamic routes. For them, we would use getStaticPaths to tell NextJS all the possible paths for this dynamic route. How come it's server rendered over here? Well, it is server rendered because we did not specify different paths for it. And the way that's done in NextJS 13, if I just come in here in the docs, we have this generate static params. And this is a function called generate static params instead of get static paths, which can be used in combination with our dynamic routes to define a list of route segments or parameters that will be statically generated at build time instead of on demand. What we need to do is to export the generate static params from the page component of our dynamic route to tell NextJS what possible parameters exist for our dynamic route, so you can go ahead and generate those statically at build time. So let's go to our page where we have the user ID dynamic route. We're going to our page component, and here I'm going to export or copy this function that I have here. And instead of get posts, which is not what we want, we can use the same function that we had in this users kind of component, where we would get all of the users from our Prisma client. So I'm going to copy that over here. And I need to import this get users from our Prisma client that we created again in the previous video. And what we're going to do is we're going to map over our users. And for each user, what we need to return is our user ID. And this is going to be user.id. So let me save this. Let me build the project again to see if exporting this function made a difference in how our site is built. By looking at the results, we see our dynamic routes are no longer server rendered, and instead they're being statically generated as HTML plus JSON. And the difference between these guys and the ones that are generated statically is one doesn't need any data, so it's just HTML, and the dynamic routes, which do need data to be fetched at build time, are using HTML plus JSON, which is the equivalent of running getStaticProps in NextJS 12 together with the getStaticPaths. Now the rest is identical to our first build. So let me just make this smaller. Let me restart the dev server. In the next step, we're going to extend our Prisma schema to create a new collection for tweets and create a relationship between our users collection and tweets collection so we can fetch tweets for a specific user and show it on the client side. So we close all of these pages over here and open up our Prisma schema. To speed up the process, let me copy over this new tweet model that I created. I'm going to explain what we're actually doing over here. So let me close this off so we have more space. Now I've added this tweet model, which is representing a collection in MongoDB, and inside of it there are documents that have ID. Body is the string or text of the tweet. number of likes on each tweet. Now we're creating a relationship between this collection and the users collection by including this user kind of line over here. What we're saying is that this is a relationship field which indicates or relates the user ID field in this tweets collection to an ID of a user. Now in the user, I'm also mentioning that I have a tweets field, which would be an array of tweets. Now, how do we go about adding some tweets to our users? So if you remember from our previous video, we created this API endpoints for our user that would allow us to get users or create a new user by passing in data, which would then call this create user function from our Prisma client, which then goes ahead and creates a user with that data. So I'm using that same API endpoint to also insert some tweets for my user. So when I'm creating the new user, I'm also passing in this tweets key, which is this object that passes this API from Prisma that says create many, and then I'm passing in some data, which are going to be the actual tweets that have a body and likes, and then the relationship, the user ID, also the _ID for this specific documents in the tweets collection are going to be generated automatically. As you can see down here, the user is created. If I open my MongoDB Compass, you can see that these tweets are now generated, and each tweet is related to a user via this user ID field, which is pointing to one of our users or the ID of one of the users. So let me close this off. Just a quick reminder that anytime you make any changes to your Prisma schema, you need to run npx prisma generate to take the new changes into consideration and generate that Prisma client for you so you can actually work with this collection and data. So let me just restart the dev server. Now that we have our tweets, let's actually fetch them on the client side so that when we are navigating to a user, we would be able to see their tweets on this side. So let me just close this schema Prisma file and go to our app, users, and user ID. This is where we're working. To speed up the process, let me just copy over this component I've already created. What we're doing here in the first section, we're just rendering this image and the name and email. This is what we had already. And what we're adding to it is this little section at the end where it's going to map over the tweets for that specific user that's passed to this component. And then for each tweet, it's going to render this tweet component. So let me just create this tweet component as well. And we're going to co-locate this components in the same place as our routes. So let me just also copy over this code, and I'm going to explain what this does in a second. Before we get into the details of this tweet component, let's just go back to the user and log our current user. So let me just expand this terminal because this is a server component and we would see this log in our terminal. And right now, when we're fetching our user, there is no tweets coming in with it. That's why we need to actually tell Prisma client that when you're fetching the user, we want you to go ahead and also fetch the tweets belonging to this user. So to do that, we're going to go back to where we're fetching this specific user. We're fetching this specific user in our page component where we ran this get user by ID. We got the dynamic parameters based on route parameters. We passed the user ID to this function to get the user. This is also the same place that we exported this generate static params to generate all the users or a list of all the possible user IDs. So NextJs knows how to statically generate these. But let's go to this get user by ID, which is a function we created in our Prisma file for our users. And right now, if I close this, we're just telling it to find a unique user where ID is this ID. We have to also instruct it to actually fetch tweets or include tweets by adding. Let me just close this off. So what I'm saying here is that fetch or find a unique user where ID is this ID and include tweets true. This is going to actually go and look at the relationship field that we generated in our Prisma schema, find the relationship key, which is the user ID, goes into the tweets collection and finds all the tweets that have that user ID as this user. So now let's go back to our application. And as you can see already here on our terminal, it is showing the user and it is bringing in an array of tweets automatically on our user object with the tweets fetched. So let's just go back to our users, remove this log. And now, as you can see on the right hand side, also, we are having our tweets rendered over here. Let's take a closer look at the tweet component. The first thing we notice is this use client directive at the top, which indicates to NextJS that this is a client component, so we can use React hooks such as use state or use effect to add some interactivity to this tweet so users can like and unlike our tweets. Now let's ignore this use state and use effect for a second. All we're doing is that we're receiving a tweet and showing that tweet as a list item down here. We're having some icons hosted inside of a button, which enables the user to like or unlike a tweet. Now, the way that I'm handling it is that I have a state that looks to see if this specific tweet has been liked or not. And also I am holding a state for the total amount of likes this tweet has by reading the likes property of our tweet. Now in the use effect, whenever this liked property or state changes, I want to run a fetch request to my backend and either like or unlike this specific tweet. And the way that I'm doing this requires us to create two different API endpoints to be able to patch or update a tweet, like it or unlike it, via a fetch request to our own backend. So what are we doing here? First of all, if the like is null, this is how I initialize this like property, because I don't want to run this use effect if the user hasn't actually interacted with this button. So I'm going to return if this is not true or false and it's just initialized to the null. And then I'm going to create this endpoint where if it is liked, I'm going to hit this like endpoint, which is API tweets, and then I have a dynamic path and then like, and then I'm going to have another one for the unlike if this liked state is not true. Once I have my endpoint, I'm going to hit that endpoint, sending a patch request. I don't need anything in my body. I'm going to then resolve the response and get the tweets out of the body and then read the likes and set the likes so that we see that interacted over here. Now, right now, these two aren't working because we have not created these API endpoints. That's why even though the state is turning this heart on and off, that likes number doesn't change. So let's just go ahead and create those API endpoints. So we're going to go to Pages, to API. I'm going to create a new folder called Tweets. Inside of it, I'm going to create another folder, which is my tweet ID. That's my dynamic path. And inside of it, I want two endpoints. One for my like, and I'm going to put a file inside of it, index.js. Let me just copy over this code, and I'm going to explain what we're doing here. So inside of this API handler, I am expecting a patch request, and if it's not patched, I'm returning a 425. I'm getting the tweet ID out of the request query. This is reading the dynamic parameter of the endpoint. And with that tweet ID, I am hitting this like tweet function that I'm supposed to create in my Prisma client, which then updates that tweet by incrementing its like. So let's generate actually that function like tweet. So again, let me just go to my Prisma client. And inside of my lib folder for Prisma, I'm going to create a new file called tweets.js. And inside of this tweet.js, I'm going to create these two functions. Again, I'm importing this Prisma client. I have a function to like a tweet and a function to unlike. And what they do is that they take in a tweet ID, then they issue a query to prisma.tweet.update. They're going to find that tweet with that ID, and we're going to pass a data because we want to update, and we're going to hit the likes property, and we're going to increment it by 1. This is an atomic operation on a numerical field, which is the likes, which is a number. If you remember in our Prisma schema, this likes was an integer, and that's how you would run these atomic operations on numeric fields. And then in the unlike tweet, I'm doing the exact same thing, and with the exception of just decrementing the likes by 1. Okay, so that's the first route. Once we update this tweet, we're going to return it. So therefore, it's passed over to this tweet in our route handler, which then sends it to our front end. Now that we're here, let me just actually go ahead and create this unlike folder as well. So we're going to have another folder called unlike. Inside of it, there should be another index.js pointing to our handler for that endpoint. Let me just copy over the code real quickly over here too. Okay, let me just make this a smaller. So this is our like that calls this like tweet, and our unlike is going to call the unlike tweet unlike function. And we created these two functions in our library. So let me just close everything off over here. And now if I refresh the page, hopefully these buttons should work. So let's test them out. If I now click on this guy, this increments the likes by 1. And if I now dislike this, it decrements it by 1 back to the initial number. Now the way that I'm doing it now, if you refresh the page, we're going to lose React state. So therefore, they're just back to being not liked. And then I can like them back again. So it's not the exact correct way to do it. I just wanted to show adding state to a client component in the new Next13 kind of app directory. But the way that you would do it is that when you're liking a tweet, you actually need to add this specific tweet ID maybe to the liked tweets of this user. And then we have to compare it and see if this is already in my liked tweets. I'm going to just turn this to liked. If it isn't, I'm going to turn it off. So there's more operations that we need to do when a like or dislike happens, which is beyond the scope of this tutorial. I just wanted to show adding React hooks to a client component in the new Next.js 13 app folder. That's it for this video, folks. I hope you learned something. I'm going to continue extending our full stack app by adding more and more of the new Next.js 13 features, such as the next font. We're going to look at the new React use function, and we're going to deploy our site. If you have any questions, ask them in the comments. I'm pretty responsive there. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.